Section: Biodiversity loss. Causes of biodiversity loss. Preparation for Friday's session. Debate. Is the insect apocalypse real or just an artifact of the data? If it is real, does it matter? Preparation. Read the references on Blackboard. Do your own research. Think of arguments for and against. Global Assessment Report of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Issued by Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, IPBS, in 2019. An average of around 25% of species in assessed animal and plant groups are threatened. 1 million species already face extinction. Biodiversity is declining faster than at any time in human history. Includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Global Goals for 2050. Goal A. The integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems are maintained, enhanced, or restored, substantially increasing the area of natural ecosystems by 2050. Human-induced extinction of known threatened species is halted. Extinction rate and risk of all species are reduced tenfold. The abundance of native wild species is increased to healthy and resilient levels. The genetic diversity within populations of wild and domesticated species is maintained, safeguarding their adaptive potential. How many species are at risk of extinction? As of 2024, IUCN Red List included 163,040 species. 40,000, almost 25%, species were categorized as vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. Selected insects include dragonflies and damselflies. What does it have to do with us? Human population density. Strong predictor of biodiversity loss. E.g., best predictor of distribution of threatened birds. How worried are we? World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report 2024. Views of over 1,400 global risks experts, policymakers, and industry leaders. Surveyed in September 2023. Top for risks for 10-year period are environmental. Biodiversity loss is ranked third. Global Assessment Report of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The direct drivers of change in nature with the largest global impact have been 1. Changes in land and sea use. 2. Direct exploitation of organisms. 3. Climate change. 4. Pollution. 5. Invasion of alien species. Results of survey of future decision-makers in 37 countries. Cleespies et al. 2024. Response types. 1. All major factors except climate change are important. More common where CO2 emissions are highest. 2. All major factors except pollution are important. More common in wealthier, less polluted countries. 3. None of the major factors are important. Less common in wealthier countries. 4. Little discrimination between major and minor factors. 5. All major factors equally important. More common in biodiverse countries. 6. All major factors equally important and well discriminated from minor factors. More common in wealthier countries. 7. All major factors except invasive species are important. Less common in countries with many invasive species. 8. Invasive species somewhat less important. Less common in countries with many invasive species. Global Biodiversity Framework Targets for 2030, reducing threats to biodiversity. Target 1. All areas are under participatory integrated biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. Effective management processes addressing land and sea use change. Target 2. At least 30% of areas of degraded ecosystems are under effective restoration. Target 3. At least 30% of terrestrial, inland water, coastal and marine areas are effectively conserved and managed through systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. Target 5. Ensure that the use, harvesting and trade of wild species is sustainable, safe and legal. Target 6. Eliminate, minimize, reduce and/or mitigate the impact of invasive alien species on biodiversity and ecosystem services. Target 7. Reduce pollution risks and the negative impact of pollution. Target 8. Minimize the impact of climate change and ocean acidification on biodiversity. Targets 1 to 3, changes in land and sea use. Target 5, direct exploitation of organisms. Target 6, invasion of alien species. Target 7, pollution. Target 8, climate change. Question. Why do we still hunt and gather wild species? Hunting of wild game, bushmeat. Responsible for past megafaunal extinctions. Currently threatens large, long-lived species. 30% of threatened birds. 75% of threatened mammals. Traditional hunters. Depleted one area then moved on, nomadic. Little impact on biodiversity. Except on islands and newly colonized continents. Current bushmeat crisis. Penetration of rainforest by logging roads. Allows access to hunters from outside the forest. Use modern equipment. International demand for exotic meat. Has increased the commercial value of bushmeat. Unpredictability of other food sources. E.g. due to overfishing, climate change. Can increase dependence of local human populations on bushmeat. Consequences of overhunting for forest community composition. Hunters tend to target large to medium-sized frugivores, especially primates. Reduces seed dispersal. Decreases overall tree species richness. Decreases density of plants dispersed by large to medium-sized mammal. Tend to ignore predators of small seeds, e.g. rodents. Increase in density. Small seeded plants decrease in density. Large seeded plants increase in density. Unless they are dispersed by large to medium-sized mammals. Expansion of agricultural land. Deforestation. Has occurred for thousands of years globally. New agricultural land. Comes mainly from tropical forest clearance. Small-scale agriculture. Provides more food for poor people. Large-scale agriculture. Responds to global demand for food, animal feed, and biofuel. Habitat loss. Threatens 75% of threatened bird and mammal species. Threatens 33% of threatened plant species. Biological Dynamics of Forest Fragments Project, BDFFP, Lawrence et al. 2018. Landowners near Manaus. Clearing Amazon rainforest for farming. Thomas Lovejoy, ornithologist. Persuaded landowners to leave square blocks of forest. 5 1-hectare fragments. For 10 hectares fragments. 2 100 hectares fragments. Question. What do you think happened? Short-term consequences of forest fragmentation from BDFFP, Brazil. Declines in large mammals, primates, birds, army ants and associated species, Philomedusa frogs, dependent on peccary wallows for breeding pools, dung beetles, increases in small, non-flying mammals, mainly seed-eating rodents. Longer-term consequences of fragmentation. Absence of seed dispersers and pollinators. Many tropical trees depend on long-distance dispersal and or pollination by mammals. Fragmentations may prevent these species from reproducing. Long-term change in community composition. Large mammals tend to disperse large seeds further, usually lost from small forest fragments. Also vulnerable to hunting. Pires et al. 2018. Gold mining and mercury pollution, Gerson et al. 2022, Schlip Justicia et al. 2024. Artisanal and small-scale gold mining, ASGM. Tilde 20% of the world's gold production. Frequently informal or illegal. Largest source of atmospheric and freshwater mercury pollution. In Madre de Dios, Peru. 100,000 hectares deforested for ASGM. 3 adjacent to or within protected areas. Plants absorb mercury from atmosphere. Contaminate soil through leaf fall. Accumulates in bodies of songbirds. Insectivores and frugivores. In French Guiana. Contaminates nursery pools of poison frogs. Associated with poorer condition of tadpoles. Invasive non-native species. Definitions: Non-native species Secretariat. Non-native species. A species, subspecies, or lower taxon, introduced, i.e. by human action, outside its natural past or present distribution. Invasive non-native species. Any non-native animal or plant that has the ability to spread, causing damage to the environment, the economy, our health, and the way we live. Chytrid fungus. Batrachochytrium dendrobatidis. Lives on skin of amphibians. Eats keratin. Can kill adult frogs in weeks. Tadpoles carry the fungus but do not die. Has infected 350 amphibian species. Major factor in global amphibian decline. Cryptogenic origin is unknown. Has spread worldwide. Possibly through trade in African clawed toad. Resistant carrier of BD. Sold worldwide as pregnancy tests, laboratory animals, and pets. Reality check, 10's rule. Of non-native species entering an ecosystem, 10% will survive and become established. 10% of these, 1% of total, will become invasive. Establishment depends on propagule pressure, frequency of introductions, minimum population size, to withstand disasters, to reproduce effectively, climate and environment, suitable time of year. Reality check, impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. Species introductions. Usually increase local, alpha, biodiversity, but decrease global, gamma, biodiversity. Ecosystems contain more species but become more similar. Can have positive impacts on ecosystem functions and services. E.g. water hyacinth and zebra mussels filter eutrophic water. Can improve water quality. Extinction and apocalypse. Global Biodiversity Framework Global Goals for 2050. Goal A. The integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems are maintained, enhanced, or restored, substantially increasing the area of natural ecosystems by 2050. Human-induced extinction of known threatened species is halted. Extinction rate and risk of all species are reduced tenfold. The abundance of native wild species is increased to healthy and resilient levels. The genetic diversity within populations of wild and domesticated species is maintained, safeguarding their adaptive potential. Global targets for 2030, reducing threats to biodiversity. Target 4. Ensure urgent management actions. To halt human-induced extinction of known threatened species. For the recovery and conservation of species. To significantly reduce extinction risk. To maintain and restore the genetic diversity within and between populations. To maintain their adaptive potential. To minimize human-wildlife conflict for coexistence. Biodiversity. Equilibrium between speciation, colonization, and extinction. Question. How do we know when a species is extinct? Definitions. IUCN criteria. Extinct. No reasonable doubt that the last individual has died. Extinct in the wild. Known only to survive. In culture. In captivity. As a naturalized population well outside the past range. Only presumed extinct when exhaustive surveys have failed to detect it throughout its historic range. In known and or expected habitat. At appropriate times, diurnal, seasonal, annual. Very time-consuming and expensive to establish extinction. Goodbye to the Baiji. Extinction records. Bias towards flowering plants, birds, and mammals. More conspicuous and better studied. Islands. Many endemic species. Easier to document extinctions. Developed nations. Longer periods of formal study. Fewer species remaining when studies began. Terrestrial and freshwater species. Marine species. May have lower extinction rate. Evidence from fossil record. More difficult to establish extinction. Do not include. Species never known to science. Species for which no recent survey has been conducted. Recent extinction rates. Calculated as extinctions per million species per year, (MSY). In Britain, (MSY) for terrestrial and freshwater species equals 100 to 500. Background extinction rate, from fossil record. (MSY) equals 0.1 to 1. Average life expectancy of a species has dropped from 1 to 10 million years to 10,000 years. May drop further to 200 to 400 years. Current extinction rate. 100-1000x higher than background rate. Extinctions due to habitat loss. Species area relationship. Allows number of extinctions to be predicted from habitat loss. If good baseline data is available. When area is reduced, extinction rate rises above baseline. Until new equilibrium species richness is reached. Extinction debt. Lag between habitat loss and species extinctions can be substantial for long-lived species. Rate of species loss following habitat loss. Rate of extinction. High at first. Species richness much higher than new equilibrium. Many species doomed to extinction. Declines. As species richness approaches equilibrium. Exponential decay. Example, tropical birds, diamond and turbot. Land bridge islands. Cut off from South America, New Guinea and Indonesia. 10,000 years ago. By rising sea levels. Originally would have had same species as nearby mainland. Regular relationship. Between size of island and number of species lost. Allowed exponential decay model to be parameterized. Barrow, Colorado Island. Formed by construction of Panama Canal in 1914. Highly protected since then. During first 50 years. 17 bird extinctions predicted. Using model based on land bridge islands. 13 bird extinctions observed. Very close match. Species most prone to extinction. Less abundant. Restricted to wetter habitats. Insectivorous. The Insect Apocalypse, Hallman et al. 2017. 75% decline in flying insect biomass. Between 1989 and 2016. In protected areas in Germany. From Malays trap data. Declines of common insect species, Wagner et al. 2021, Van Kink et al. 2023. Most insect species are declining. Across all insect taxa. Common species declining faster than rare species, tilde 1-2% per year. Unusual pattern. Underlies rapid decline in insect biomass. Threat to ecosystem functions and services. Pollination. Biological control of pests. Nutrient cycling. Question. Why are formerly common insect species declining? Stressors, Wagner et al. 2021. General. Land use change. Especially deforestation and changes to agriculture. Climate change. Introduced species. Pollution. Specific. Insecticides. Light pollution. Does weather explain everything? Müller et al. 2023. Flying insect biomass in Germany. Increased between 2016 and 2022. Statistical model. Weather predicts changes in flying insect biomass from year to year. Possible long-term trends due to climate change. No significant effect of land use on biomass, except urban areas. But significant effect of land use on biodiversity. Question. Why are insects so susceptible to weather? Insects and Climate, Harvey et al. 2022. Insects. Ectothermic. Temperature affects growth and development. Number of eggs laid. Depends on conditions experienced by females in previous season. Survival of individuals. Depends on winter conditions. Final insect densities. Depend on weather conditions during spring and summer. Question. Why are declines in insect biodiversity difficult to measure? Difficulties in measuring insect population trends, Wagner et al. 2021. Few time series data on insect populations. Huge number of species. Most of which are undescribed. Species-level taxonomy is challenging. Often requires microscope or DNA analysis. Huge short-term variations in population size. From generation to generation. Many studies just measure insect biomass. Valuing biodiversity. Question. How do you calculate the economic value of biodiversity? Economic value of biodiversity. Direct use value. Natural products harvested and traded by humans. Ecotourism. Indirect use value. Ecosystem services. Option use value. Potential uses. Non-use value. Bequest value. Existence value. Question. What are the direct uses of biodiversity? Option value. Species may have unexploited potential, e.g. for medicine, genetic resources, or biomimicry. Loss of species is irreversible loss of information. Question. Which human inventions have been inspired by nature? Indirect use of biodiversity, ecosystem services. Benefits that people obtain from ecosystems. Not directly traded. E.g. marine ecosystems. Support commercially valuable fish populations. Absorb and sequester carbon. E.g. forest ecosystems. Provide pollinators for crop species. Protect agricultural and urban areas from flooding. Produce oxygen. Value of ecosystem services. Estimate of global value of ecosystem services, GEP. Higher than GDP in most countries. Often benefit people outside the country in which they are generated. Question. Does biodiversity enhance ecosystem services? Biodiversity and Ecosystem Function, Gaston and Spicer, 2004. Experiments. Most common outcome. At low levels of biodiversity, adding species increases ecosystem function. At higher levels of biodiversity, adding species has less effect, redundancy. Possible mechanisms. Sampling effect. A few species have major impacts on ecosystem function. The greater the number of species, the greater the probability of including one of these. Niche complementarity. Species use resources in different ways. A larger number of species will use resources more thoroughly. Positive interactions among species. Ecosystem services that benefit from biodiversity. Ocean productivity. Water quality. Decomposition. Disease limitation. Biodiversity and planetary stability. Ecosystem function stabilize Earth's atmospheric composition, e.g. balance of O2 and CO2. Water cycle, e.g. rainfall, retention of hydrogen. Climate, e.g. carbon sequestration. Loss of species. Simplifies ecosystems. Reduces ecosystem functions. May destabilize planetary conditions. Economic value of great whales, Chami et al. 2019. Economic value of great whale. Estimated based on carbon sequestration, indirect. Fishery enhancement, indirect. Ecotourism, direct. Estimated at $2 million each. Over $1 trillion for entire stock. Question. If the ecosystem services produced by biodiversity have such high economic value, why aren't we doing more to protect it? Ecosystem services as a public goods. Public goods. Benefits are dispersed. Everyone benefits equally. Owners of biodiversity. Landowners, governments of biodiverse countries, etc. Pay the costs of conserving biodiversity, including opportunity costs. Receive no more benefit than anyone else. May receive more immediate benefit from destroying or degrading it. Everyone else receives the benefits of biodiversity, regardless of how little they pay towards conserving it. Little incentive to pay their fair share towards conservation. Incentives for biodiversity conservation. Payments to owners of biodiversity. Make conservation economically beneficial. May operate nationally. E.g. payment for ecosystem services, PES, in Costa Rica. Funded through taxation. May operate internationally. E.g. debt for nature swaps. Non-use value of biodiversity. Bequest value. Potential value to future generations. Existence value. Humans tend to value species even if they don't use them. Will pay to conserve species that they will never see. Applies particularly to large, charismatic species. Intrinsic value of biodiversity. Biodiversity has value independent of human judgments. Recognized by many societies, cultures, and faiths. Stated in many regional and global treaties for conservation. Philosophically problematic. How are we defining a value here? Value of a rainforest? Question. How much is this rainforest worth? Question. How much money could I make from the rainforest? Direct market valuation. Market price. Applies only to goods and services which can be traded commercially. Production function. Estimate of contribution to the production of other marketable goods. Applies to some ecosystem services. Question. How much would you pay to visit the rainforest? Revealed preferences. Hedonic cost. Inferred price that individuals are willing to pay for an ecosystem service. Based on House prices. Time and money spent on recreational trips. Question. How much will it cost you if the rainforest is destroyed? Revealed preferences. Replacement cost. Cost of replacing or restoring ecosystem service. Costs of biodiversity loss. Policy inaction on biodiversity loss. Predicted to cost 7% annual global GDP by 2050. Similar to predicted cost of climate change. Equivalent to value of automotive, IT, and steel industries combined. Investment in protected areas. Gives return of 25 to 100-fold. Due to ecosystem services provided. Question. How much would you pay to save the rainforest? Stated preferences. Contingent valuation. Price that individuals would be willing to pay to maintain or improve the quality of the environment. Choice modeling. Choice between ecosystem services and other goods and services. Biodiversity net gain. Legislation. Introduced in the UK in 2021. Developers must produce at least 10% net gain in biodiversity for 30 years. Where BNG cannot be achieved on development site, it must be offset in off-site habitats. Where excess BNG is achieved, BNG units can be sold on the open market. Habitat banks. Created by charities and private enterprises. On their own land or unprofitable land leased from farmers. Create high-value habitat in advance of development. Generates biodiversity units for sale. Provide security for buyers. Because habitat has already been created successfully. Can be integrated into nature recovery networks. Producing connected areas of habitat. Example, Saltersford Farm, Cheshire. Former cropland planted with woodland and wildflower meadows. Question. Will biodiversity offsetting and trading be good for conservation? What are the potential problems? Biodiversity metric, Natural England. Habitats. Area, ha, hedgerow, kilometre, or watercourse, kilometre. Habitat quality components. Distinctiveness, multiplier of 0 to 8. Based on habitat type. Condition, multiplier of 0 to 3. Assessed according to specific methodology. Strategic significance, multiplier of the 1st of January, 15. Depends on whether habitat has been identified as locally important. In local plans and policies. Biodiversity metric, Natural England. Habitat interventions. Habitat retention. Habitat is retained in the same condition. Habitat enhancement. 1. Improvement in condition. 2. Change to higher distinctiveness habitat. Habitat creation. 1. Loss of habitat and replacement with another. 2. Change in broad habitat type. Biodiversity metric, Natural England. Risk multipliers. Difficulty of creation or enhancement, multiplier of 0.33 to 1. Time to target condition, multiplier of 0.33 to 1. Categories. 1 to 5 years, x1. 6 to 10 years, x 0.71. 11 to 20 years, x 0.5. 20 plus years, x 0.33. Distance of off-site habitat from impact site, multiplier of 0.5 to 1. Criticisms of the biodiversity metric approach. Habitats created only need to be maintained for 30 years. What happens then? Prioritization of on-site and nearby enhancement measures. Makes it difficult to contribute to strategic green infrastructure projects. E.g. to create large habitat blocks or reconnect habitat fragments. Time and difficulty risk multipliers. Disincentivize creation of high distinctiveness habitats, e.g. oak woodland. High risk that landowners will fail to deliver. E.g. due to unanticipated problems during 30-year period. Traditional ecological knowledge. TEK, and ethnobotany. Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity. Framework Global Goals for 2050. Goal C. The monetary and non-monetary benefits. From the utilization of genetic resources. From digital sequence information on genetic resources. Of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. Are shared fairly and equitably. Including with indigenous peoples and local communities. Are substantially increased. While ensuring traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources is appropriately protected. contributing to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Question: what is traditional ecological knowledge? Traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, acquired through extensive observation of an area or a species, passed down in an oral tradition, shared among users of a resource, not scientific but has empirical basis, used to understand and predict environmental events, may be crucial to livelihood or survival of individuals, used in ecological and conservation biological research, assessments of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Question: how would you, as a scientist, gain access to traditional ecological knowledge? Methods for documenting TEK, mainly drawn from social science research. Selection of participants. Peer selection. Community council. May identify experts. Chain referrals. Each participant suggests names of further expert. Semi-directive interview. Conversation. May be recorded. No fixed questionnaire, though list of discussion topics may be used. No time limit. Interview. Guides discussions. Allows direction and scope of interview to follow. Participants' thoughts. Opportunities for participants to make unanticipated associations. E.g., beavers claim to affect distribution of beluga whales by damming spawning streams for the salmon on which they feed. Questionnaire. Useful when the interview knows exactly what information they require. Allows responses to be quantified. Open-ended questions. Can still allow participants to make new connections. Analytical workshop. Bring together scientists and holders of TEK to analyze data. May offer fresh perspectives. To understand one another's perspectives. To jointly develop priorities for management and future research. E.g., Alaska Beluga Whale Committee, ABWC. Include scientists and other stakeholders, including holders of TEK. Holds workshops to interpret data. Collaborative fieldwork. Allows scientists and holders of TEK to interact over extended period. TEK can be used to locate study sites, obtain specimens, interpret field results. Example, Alaska bowhead whale census. Scientists initially made visual counts of migrating bowhead whales from sites on cliffs and shorefast ice, along the lead lane of open water through which whales migrated. Estimated population of 2,000 to 3,000 whales. Eskimos traveled over the pack ice, saw migrating whales far from the lead, where they would not have been visible to scientists. At times when the lead was closed, when scientists were not making observations. Challenged scientists' estimates in analytical workshops. New census. Used acoustic and aerial methods. Detected migrating whales far from lead and when lead was closed. Increased estimate to 6,000 to 8,000 whales. Example, species-rich pastures of Europe. Conservation managers. Using cattle to prevent shrub encroachment. Traditional herders. Understand cattle grazing preferences towards greater than 100 plant species. Can efficiently increase the daily biomass intake of livestock by encouraging consumption of a more diverse array of plants. Prevents of under- and overgrazing. Allows targeted removal of pasture weeds, litter, encroaching shrub, tall competitive plants, and invasive alien species. Example, Amazon rainforest. Scientists initially assumed that rainforests were pristine environments. Little human impact. Ethnobotanists learned that indigenous people have actively managed forest plants over wide areas for thousands of years. Modifications included removal of non-useful plants, protection, transportation, and plantation of useful plants, attraction of seed dispersers, selection of phenotypes, fire and soil management, created diverse forest patches with many edible species, gradient from pristine to domesticated. Ethnobotany, study of how indigenous people have used to learn plant products for food and spices, for essential oils, for fiber, for pigments, for poisons, used for hunting and fishing, for hallucinogens and stimulants, Cultural transmission. Knowledge. Discovered mainly by trial and error. Over thousands of years. Varies between communities. Usually transmitted orally. Often kept by a single member of a community. Often revered as a shaman. Can be lost easily. If keeper dies before passing it on. Potential for new drugs. Western medicine. 120 plant-based prescription drugs. Derived from 95 plant species. Only 1% of Amazonian plant species have been examined for medicinal compounds. Traditional shamans and other healers use a much greater range of plants. Include treatments for severe nervous disorders. Example, traditional uses of plants in northwest Amazonia. Diarrhea, 38 species. Headache, 25 species. Muscular aches and pains, 18 species. Toothache, 38 species. Ant bites, 16 species. Intestinal parasites, 36 species. Snake bites, 29 species. Contraceptives, 26 species. The effectiveness of many of these has not been scientifically tested. Bioprospecting. Research vessel Alpha Helix. Sailed the Amazon for a year. Collected 960 plants for onboard biochemical analysis. Merck Pharmaceutical Company. Entered into an agreement with government of Costa Rica. Funded plant taxonomy and conservation. In exchange for rights to survey plants for compounds of potential medical use. Benefit sharing. Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. Conservation of biodiversity can only be achieved if benefits from use are distributed fairly and equitably. Resources of one nation should not be exploited by other nations or companies with no recompense. Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Global Goals for 2050. Goal C. The monetary and non-monetary benefits from the utilization of genetic resources. From digital sequence information on genetic resources. Of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. Are shared fairly and equitably. Including with indigenous peoples and local communities. Are substantially increased. While ensuring traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources is appropriately protected. Contributing to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Question. How can financial benefits be derived from biodiversity? Question. How can the financial benefits derived from biodiversity be shared with governments and citizens of biodiverse countries, local communities and indigenous people, holders of traditional ecological knowledge? Ethnobotany. Economic and health benefits arising from ethnobotany should be shared with people who originally acquired the knowledge, many of whom depend on plant medicines for primary health care. E.g. Terra Nova Medicinal Plant Reserve, Belize. Established by Belize Association of Traditional Healers. Includes members of most cultural and ethnic groups. Managed for cultivation and documentation of medicinally useful plants. Protection of plants from overharvesting. Ethnobotanical and ecological research. Ecotourism. Example, biodiversity. Research in Costa Rica. 25% of the world's biodiversity research is done in Costa Rica. National Institute for Biodiversity, INBio. Created in 1989 to perform inventory of biodiversity. Took over databases of National Museum. Obtained funds via a Debt for Nature's deals. Now also receives funding from Inter-American Development Bank. Private foundations. Environmental NGOs. Made bioprospecting agreements with global pharmaceutical companies. E.g. Merck in 1991 to 1999. Searches for new products. Derived from wild Costa Rican organisms. Of interest to chemical, pharmaceutical, agricultural and biotechnology industries. Benefit sharing from bioprospecting in Costa Rica. Benefits to Costa Rica. Financial contributions from international partners. Costs of research. Contribution to protected wildlife areas. Equivalent to 10% of the budget. Royalties on products that reach the market. Probably less than 5%. Technology transfers. Training of Costa Rican scientists. Donations of research equipment and infrastructure. Benefits to international partners. Exclusive access to biological samples. Access to the knowledge of Costa Rica's parataxonomists. Locally recruited field workers. Reputational benefits. Example, bioprospecting agreement. Diversa. US-based industrial biotechnology company. Made agreement with Costa Rican government in 2002. InBio. Collects specimens for Diversa. Retains ownership of the specimens. InBio receives access to. Benefits from technology, equipment and the creation of capacity. Guarantees that Diversa's technology will not be used to collect and process specimens for other companies. Diversa. Owns DNA sequences produced by InBio. Pays the wages and other expenses of at least one InBio staff member. Pays share of profits to InBio. If Diversa licenses a product to a customer from samples obtained from InBio. Question. The monetary and non-monetary benefits are shared fairly and equitably, including with indigenous peoples and local communities. Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Global Goals for 2050. Do these kinds of bioprospecting agreements meet this criterion? If not, why not? Criticisms. Indigenous communities and other holders of TEK do not seem to benefit from bioprospecting agreements. Only a few people are employed as parataxonomists. Traditionally share knowledge freely. Purchasing specimens or knowledge from individuals can cause conflict with other community members. Example, payment for ecosystem services, PES, in Costa Rica. Financed by tax on fossil fuels. Voluntary contract. Compensates landowners for conserving forests and protecting watersheds. Incentivizes sustainable land use practices. Forest protection. Reforestation. Natural forest regeneration. Agroforestry systems. Selective harvesting of timber from reforested areas. Fosters a sense of stewardship among local communities. Forest cover. 1940s. Rainforest covered 75% of Costa Rica. 1987. 33 to 50% of forest cover destroyed. One of the world's highest deforestation rates. Mainly due to agricultural expansion and logging. 1996. Less than 25% forest cover remained. Meat exports declined. Pastures abandoned. Costa Rican government made it illegal to cut down forest without official approval. Introduced payments for ecosystem services. 2020. 30% land covered by old-growth forest. 16% land covered by secondary forest. 58% land covered by forests of all kinds. Ecotourism in Costa Rica. Costa Rica receives 3 million tourists each year. Most visited nation in Central America. Greater than 60% visit because of its natural environment. Accounts for 8% of GDP. Employs 200,000 people. Sustainable tourism certification. Recognizes tourism businesses committed to environmentally friendly practices. Encourages sustainable tourism development. Helps visitors make responsible choices. Biodiversity of birds, reptiles, and mammals is positively correlated with tourism, Echeverry et al. 2022. Ecotourism in Costa Rica. Indigenous peoples may not benefit from ecotourism on their lands. E.g. Malacu entrepreneurs in Costa Rica have set up their own tours and activities. Medicinal plant walks. Archery lessons. Art classes. Traditional Malacu ceremonies and food. Most visitors to Tenorio Volcano National Park are not taken to their villages. Debt for nature swaps. Many countries have high national debts. Debt is traded internationally at values below face value. Can be bought by conservation organizations. Can be given back to debtor country in exchange for conservation agreement. Exchange can occur directly between two governments. Facilitated by conservation NGO. E.g. USA forgave $26 million of debt owed by Costa Rica. Costa Rica agreed to spend the same amount on forest conservation. Wednesday, benefit sharing agreement role-playing game scenario. Costa Biodiversa is a small country in the near tropics. It has high biodiversity in its remaining fragments of rainforest, but these are being rapidly destroyed by agricultural expansion. Indigenous people live in the rainforest but have no land rights. They rely upon their extensive knowledge of the forest's plants for medicines, poisons, and ceremonial drugs. Costa Biodiversa owes a huge debt to the wealthy nation União Avra Civitatibus, UAC, and relies upon agricultural exports to service the debt. It has been calculated that the financial value to the rest of the world of the ecosystem services provided by the rainforests of Costa Biodiversa far exceeds the value of its exports. The UAC-based pharmaceutical company Medicinae Nobis sees huge potential to develop new drugs from the rainforest plants of Costa Biodiversa. The environmental NGO Green Planet International, GPI, has been tasked with brokering a benefit-sharing agreement to use the country's biodiversity sustainably and fairly and protect biodiversity in accordance with the principles of the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. Roles: Government of Costa Biodiversa, UAC Ministry for Overseas Development, Medicinae Nobis, UAC-based pharmaceutical company, Indigenous Peoples Alliance, Landowners Representatives, Green Planet International, Biodiversity Policy, Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD Articles 6 to 8. Question: what are the aims and objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity? Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD. International treaty. Signed by greater than 150 nations in 1992. At UN Conference on Environment and Development, Rio de Janeiro. Objectives: conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of its components, in a way and at a rate that does not lead to long-term decline of biological diversity, maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of present and future generations, equitable sharing of the benefits arising from the utilization of genetic resources. Social context: conservation of biodiversity can only be achieved through sustainable use. If benefits from use are distributed fairly and equitably, resources of one nation should not be exploited by other nations or companies with no recompense. Article 6, General Measures for Conservation and Sustainable Use. Establish national strategies, plans, or programs, specifically for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, or develop these further if they already exist. National, regional, and local biodiversity action plans. Integrate conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity into relevant sectoral or cross-sectoral plans, programs, and policies, e.g. agriculture, education, energy, employment, health, industry, transport. Perverse subsidies. Adverse in the long term. For both environment and economy. Value of subsidies often exceeds market value of goods produced, e.g. commercial fishing subsidies. Value of subsidies exceeds value of fish produced. Has led to assembly of huge, expensive fishing fleets, too large to be supported by fish stocks in territorial waters. Expanded into international waters once territorial waters were exhausted. Led to overharvesting of fish and destruction of marine habitats. Question: can you think of other perverse subsidies? Chinese fishing fleet. Other examples of perverse subsidies. Subsidized agriculture. Only recognized value of food production. Led to overloading of croplands and overuse of fertilizers and pesticides. Soil exhaustion, erosion, pollution, and release of greenhouse gases. Subsidized fossil fuel extraction. Led to overuse and failure to develop alternatives. Pollution and release of greenhouse gases. Subsidized road transport. Led to excessive road building and use of vehicles. Habitat destruction, pollution. Subsidized water. Led to overuse and misuse. Depletion of supplies and destruction of freshwater habitats. Article 7, Identification and Monitoring. Obliges nations to identify those components of biodiversity most important for conservation and sustainable use. Monitor them. Identify human activities likely to have negative effects upon these components of biodiversity. Monitor these effects. Maintain and organize data from these monitoring programs. Article 8A of B, In situ conservation. Obliges nations to establish a system of protected areas. Develop guidelines for selection, establishment, and management of protected areas. Questions: are the existing networks of protected areas adequate? If not, why not? Problems with existing protected areas. Existing network of protected areas is too small. At least 30% of land and ocean area must be designated in order to meet CBD goals. Most individual reserves are very small. Too small to accommodate populations of large vertebrates. Most reserves were not chosen for their conservation value. Usually selected because there were few competing land uses, e.g. land of low economic value or buffer zones on national borders. Many designated areas have little effective protection. Network of reserves is static, with low levels of connectivity between reserves. Cannot accommodate climate-driven species range shifts. Priority areas for reserves. Based on species richness, endemism, and threat. Attempt to make reserves complementary, i.e. conserve largest number of species within entire reserve network. Identified by conservation charities. BirdLife International. Endemic bird areas. Conservation International. Biodiversity hotspots. Major tropical wilderness areas. World Resource Institute. Frontier forests. WWF and World Conservation Union. Centers of Plant Diversity. WWF USA. Global 200 ecoregions. BirdLife endemic bird areas. Article 8C, in situ conservation. Regulate manage. Biological resources important for conservation of biodiversity, whether within or outside protected areas, with a view to conservation and sustainable use. Promote the protection of ecosystems and natural habitats, the maintenance of viable populations in natural surroundings, environmentally sound and sustainable development in areas adjacent to protected areas, with a view to furthering protection of those areas. Question: is it enough to conserve biodiversity inside reserves? If not, why not? Need for biodiversity conservation outside of reserves. Biodiversity inside reserve. Affected by quality of environment surrounding reserve. Threats from outside reserve, e.g. pollution, hunting. Many species are not represented within reserves. Majority of populations exist outside of reserves. Migrate or disperse beyond reserve boundaries. Have a range that is likely to shift with climate change. Requires conservation in the matrix of land between reserves. Article 8F, in situ conservation. Rehabilitate and restore degraded ecosystems. Promote the recovery of threatened species. Article 8GH, in situ conservation. Regulate, manage, control release of organisms modified by biotechnology. Prevent introduction of, control or eradicate alien species which threaten ecosystems, habitats or species. Article 8IJ, in situ conservation. Endeavor to provide conditions for compatibility between present uses, conservation and sustainable uses of biodiversity. Respect, preserve and maintain knowledge, innovations and practices of indigenous and local communities, where these embody traditional lifestyles relevant to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Promote the wider application of such knowledge, innovations and practices, with approval and involvement of indigenous and local communities. Encourage equitable sharing of the benefits arising from such knowledge, innovations, and practices. Article 8KEM, in situ conservation. Develop and maintain legislation and or other regulatory provisions for protection of threatened species and populations, where a significant adverse effect on biodiversity has been determined. Regulate or manage the relevant activities. Cooperate in providing support, financial and other, for in situ conservation, particularly to developing countries. Latitude, wealth, and conservation. Countries at low latitudes tend to have higher biodiversity, tend to have lower wealth, fewer resources for conservation, tend to be more severely affected by damage to ecosystems. Populations depend on local ecosystem services for food, fuel, fiber, medicine, protection from flooding, etc. Too poor to obtain these from elsewhere if local ecosystems collapse. Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD Articles 9 to 11. COP15 and the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. CBD Article 9, ex situ conservation. Predominantly for the purpose of complementing in situ measures. Adopt measures for ex situ conservation and research of components of biodiversity, preferably in their country of origin. Adopt measures for recovery and rehabilitation of threatened species, and their reintroduction into their natural habitats, under appropriate conditions. Regulate and manage collection of biological resources from natural habitats. For ex situ conservation purposes, so as not to threaten ecosystems or in situ populations, except where special, temporary ex situ methods are required. For recovery and rehabilitation of threatened species, cooperate in providing financial and other support. For ex situ conservation, for establishment and maintenance of ex situ conservation facilities in developing countries. Ex situ conservation. Types of ex situ conservation: seed banks, sperm and ova banks, tissue culture collections, artificial propagation of plants, captive breeding of animals. Issues: ethics of keeping animals in captivity, diversion of resources from in situ conservation, viability of captive populations, efficacy of reintroductions, secondary benefits, education, research. Article 10, Sustainable Use of Biological Resources. Integrate consideration of the conservation and sustainable use of biological resources into national decision-making. Adopt measures to avoid or minimize adverse impacts of use of biological resources on biodiversity. Protect and encourage customary use of biological resources in accordance with traditional cultural practices, where these are compatible with conservation and sustainable use. Support local populations to develop and implement remedial action in degraded areas where biodiversity has been reduced. Encourage cooperation between government and the private sector to develop methods for sustainable use of biological resources. Sustainable use. Global ecological footprint of human population far exceeds Earth's productivity. Most present uses of biological resources are unsustainable. Sustainable use requires national planning, requires support of local people, support for customary artisanal use, where this is sustainable. Article 11, Incentive Measures. Adopt ecologically and socially sound measures that act as incentives for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. COP15. United Nations Biodiversity Conference in 2022. Chaired by China and hosted by Canada. Ended with landmark agreement to guide global action on nature through to 2030. Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, GBF. Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Vision. By 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, and wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. Mission. By 2030, to take urgent action, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to put nature on a path to recovery, for the benefit of people and planet, by conserving and sustainably using biodiversity, by ensuring the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources, while providing the necessary means of implementation. Global Goals for 2050. Goal A. The integrity, connectivity, and resilience of all ecosystems are maintained, enhanced, or restored, substantially increasing the area of natural ecosystems by 2050. Human-induced extinction of known threatened species is halted. Extinction rate and risk of all species are reduced tenfold. The abundance of native wild species is increased to healthy and resilient levels. The genetic diversity within populations of wild and domesticated species is maintained, safeguarding their adaptive potential. Global Goals for 2050. Goal B. Biodiversity is sustainably used and managed. Nature's contributions to people, including ecosystem functions and services, are valued, maintained, and enhanced. Those currently in decline are restored, supporting the achievement of sustainable development for the benefit of present and future generations. Global Goals for 2050. Goal C. The monetary and non-monetary benefits from the utilization of genetic resources, from digital sequence information on genetic resources, of traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources, are shared fairly and equitably, including with indigenous peoples and local communities, are substantially increased, while ensuring traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources is appropriately protected, contributing to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Global Goals for 2050. Goal D. Adequate means of implementation, including financial resources, capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation, access to and transfer of technology are secured and equitably accessible to all parties, especially developing countries, in particular the least developed countries and small island developing states, countries with economies in transition, progressively closing the biodiversity finance gap of $700 billion per year. Global targets for 2030, reducing threats to biodiversity. Target 1. All areas are under participatory integrated biodiversity inclusive spatial planning. Effective management processes addressing land and sea use change. Target 2. At least 30% of areas of degraded ecosystems are under effective restoration. Target 3. At least 30% of terrestrial, inland water, coastal and marine areas are effectively conserved and managed through systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. Global targets for 2030, reducing threats to biodiversity. Target 4. Ensure urgent management actions to halt human-induced extinction of known threatened species, for the recovery and conservation of species, to significantly reduce extinction risk, to maintain and restore the genetic diversity within and between populations, to maintain their adaptive potential, to minimize human-wildlife conflict for coexistence. Target 5. Ensure that the use, harvesting and trade of wild species is sustainable, safe and legal. Global targets for 2030, reducing threats to biodiversity. Target 6. Eliminate, minimize, reduce and/or mitigate the impact of invasive alien species on biodiversity and ecosystem services by identifying and managing pathways of the introduction of alien species, by preventing the introduction and establishment of priority invasive alien species, by reducing the rates of introduction and establishment of other known or potential invasive alien species by at least 50%, by eradicating or controlling invasive alien species, especially in priority sites such as islands. Global targets for 2030, reducing threats to biodiversity. Target 7. Reduce pollution risks and the negative impact of pollution to levels that are not harmful to biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services. Reducing excess nutrients lost to the environment by at least half. Reducing the overall risk from pesticides and highly hazardous chemicals by at least half. Preventing, reducing, and working towards eliminating plastic pollution. Target 8. Minimize the impact of climate change and ocean acidification on biodiversity. Increase its resilience through mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction actions. Nature-based solutions. Ecosystem-based approaches. Minimize negative and foster positive impacts of climate action on biodiversity. Global targets for 2030, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. Target 9. Ensure that the management and use of wild species are sustainable. Target 10. Ensure that areas under agriculture, aquaculture, fisheries, and forestry are managed sustainably. Target 11. Restore, maintain, and enhance nature's contributions to people, including ecosystem functions and services. Target 12. Significantly increase the area and quality and connectivity of, access to, and benefits from green and blue spaces in urban and densely populated areas sustainably. Global targets for 2030, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. Target 13. Ensure the fair and equitable sharing of benefits that arise from the utilization of genetic resources. Target 14. Ensure the full integration of biodiversity into policies, regulations, etc. within and across all levels of government and across all sectors. Target 15. Encourage and enable businesses to regularly monitor, assess, and transparently disclose their risks, dependencies, and impacts on biodiversity. Provide information needed to consumers to promote sustainable consumption patterns. Report on compliance with access and benefit sharing regulations and measures. Global targets for 2030, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. Target 16. Ensure that people are encouraged and enabled to make sustainable consumption choices. Reduce the global footprint of consumption in an equitable manner. Halving global food waste. Significantly reducing overconsumption. Substantially reducing waste generation. Target 17. Establish, strengthen capacity for, and implement biosafety measures. Target 18. Identify and eliminate, phase out or reform incentives, including subsidies, harmful for biodiversity. Reduce them by at least $500 billion per year. Scale up positive incentives for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Mirrorboard Group. Global targets for 2030, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. Target 19. Increase the level of financial resources from all sources. Mobilize at least $200 billion per year. Increase total biodiversity-related international financial resources from developed countries to developing countries to at least $30 billion per year. Increase domestic resource mobilization. Prepare and implement national biodiversity finance plans. Leverage private finance. Encourage the private sector to invest in biodiversity. Stimulate innovative schemes, e.g. payment for ecosystem services, green bonds, biodiversity offsets and credits, benefit sharing mechanisms, with environmental and social safeguards. Optimize co-benefits and synergies of finance targeting the biodiversity and climate crises. Enhance the role of collective actions, including by indigenous peoples and local communities. Enhance the effectiveness, efficiency, and transparency of resource provision and use. Global targets for 2030, meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. Target 20. Strengthen capacity building and development. Promote access to technology, innovation, and scientific cooperation. Target 21. Ensure that the best available data, information, and knowledge are accessible to decision makers, practitioners, and the public. Target 22. Ensure full, equitable participation in decision-making, access to justice and information related to biodiversity by indigenous peoples and local communities, by women and girls, children and youth, by persons with disabilities. Full protection of environmental human rights defenders. Target 23. Ensure gender equality in the implementation of the framework. Approaches to global biodiversity conservation. Questions. What is rewilding? How does it differ from conventional conservation? Conventional conservation approaches. Rearguard actions. To prevent further loss of biodiversity and ecosystem function. Focus on protected areas. Protect remaining areas of high ecological value. Specific aims and targets. Conservation of specific endangered species. Conservation of small areas of threatened habitats. Recent baseline. Pre-industrial or pre-colonial ecosystem. May have already been severely degraded. Protected areas. Main means through which conservation aims are achieved. 260,000 protected areas in August 2020. Terrestrial protected areas. Marine protected areas. IUCN categories. 1A strict nature reserve. Managed mainly for science. 1B wilderness area. Managed mainly for wilderness protection. 2. National park. Managed mainly for ecosystem protection and recreation. 3. Natural monument. Managed mainly for conservation of specific natural features. For habitat hit species management area. Managed mainly for conservation. Through management intervention. 5. Protected landscape seascape. Managed mainly for landscape seascape conservation and recreation. 6. Managed resource protected area. Managed mainly for sustainable use of natural ecosystems. Degrees of protection. Proposed. Described in official government strategies. Designated. Boundaries officially mapped. Legally binding land use plan. Gazetted. Enclosure of reserve. Erection of fences or boundary markers. Consultation with local people. Paper parks. Exist in official documents and reports. No effective management. Physical reality is no different to unprotected site. Habitat management. Reserve. May contain a pristine natural habitat. May contain habitat produced by interaction between culture and landscape. E.g. low-intensity agriculture. In Europe, little natural habitat remains. Most terrestrial nature reserves aim to conserve historic landscapes. Produced by pre-mechanized agriculture, pre-1850s. Probably less biodiverse than pre-agricultural habitat. Conserving relict habitat patches. Pre-industrial land management. Low-intensity farming. Extensive and seasonal cropping. Extensive grazing. Requires old breed cattle. Organic fertilizers. Hedge laying. Reed cutting. Clearing ditches and dikes. Labor intensive. Usually performed by volunteer teams. Can sometimes be mimicked mechanically. Compositionalist approach to management. Focuses on identities of species present. Aims to restore sight at a favorable environmental condition. Species and habitats resemble those thought to have occurred there in the past. Allows targets and indicators to be specified. Allows success to be measured by counting species. E.g. number of wading bird species supported by wet grassland. Example, heathland. Transitional disturbed habitat. Between grassland and woodland. Heathland animals and plants. E.g. smooth snake, Dartford warbler. Naturally occur in forest clearings, cliffs, etc. Humans. Intensively grazed uplands. Created large areas of heath. Options for maintaining heath. Resume grazing. Requires employment of cowherd. Use controlled burning and heath bashing. Requires army of volunteers. Limitations of reserves for species management. Reserve might be too small to contain viable population. Environmental conditions may change. Poachers may enter reserve. Animals may wander beyond reserve boundaries. Landscape scale conservation. Creating wildlife-rich areas by restoring ecosystem functions. Requires restoration of the wider landscape. Beyond the reserve boundaries. Approaches. Purchase land. Influence the planning system. Work with government to influence policy. The wider environment. Nature reserves. Exist within matrix of agricultural land. Can be connected. By making matrix less hostile. By campaigning for changes in agricultural practice. By buying more land for conservation. To create corridors and stepping stones between reserves. E.g. Great Fens Project. Bought and restored farmland between two fen reserves. Landscape and climate. Climate corridors. Connect habitat patches. Enable wildlife to track their ecological niche. E.g. by moving to higher latitude of altitude. Enhancing permeability. Take every opportunity to increase habitat connectivity. E.g. restoring hedgerows or riparian vegetation. Increasing uncertainty, e.g. due to climate change. Favors functionalist approach. Focus on processes rather than outcomes. Even at site level. Functionalist approach to management. Aims to restore ecosystem functions. Water cycling. Nutrient cycling. Can provide ecosystem services for humans. Recharging of aquifers. Pollination of crop plants. Erosion control. Flood control. Rewilding and biodiversity. Questions. What is rewilding? How does it differ from other forms of biodiversity conservation? Milovice Reserve, Czech Republic. Rewilding approach. Optimistic approach. Aims to reverse loss of natural ecosystems. Restore ecosystem functions and services. Often takes place on land of initially low ecological value. No specific aims or targets. Restore natural processes and see what happens. Considers ambitious baselines, e.g. late Pleistocene. Considers novel ecosystems. Functionality more important than species composition. Rewilding, original concept. Rewilding concept. Emerged in North America in the 1980s. Originally called wilderness recovery. Key features, Seoul and Norse 1998. Large core protected areas. Ecological connectivity. Keystone species and trophic interactions. 3CS model. Cause, corridors and carnivores. Defining rewilding, Carver et al. 2021. Term rewilding used in many different ways. Taken up by many different disciplines. Has caused confusion, misrepresentation, and opposition. IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management, CEM. Mandated Rewilding Thematic Group, RTG. Working toward an internationally recognized definition. Through research and consultation. Literature review, surveys, communications with experts and practitioners, workshops. Established a set of universal guiding principles for rewilding. Adopted by the Natural Capital Laboratory in the United Kingdom. Used to help develop principles in the Global Charter for Rewilding Earth, Wilderness Foundation, 2020. Principle 1. Rewilding utilizes wildlife to restore trophic interactions. Aims to establish self-sustaining ecosystem. Native species populations are regulated through predation, competition, and other biotic and abiotic interactions. Key components: large herbivores, apex predators, keystone species, ecosystem engineers. Populations may need to be reinforced or reintroduced. Principle 2. Rewilding employs landscape-scale planning that considers core areas, connectivity, and coexistence. Core areas provide a secure space. Accommodate all species that comprise a self-sustaining natural ecosystem. May be legally designated or under private management. Connectivity between core areas promotes movement and migration across the wider landscape. Improves resilience to the impacts of climate change. Coexistence between wild species and humans and their livestock. Accommodates compatible low-intensity human land use, e.g. buffers, extensive multiple-use landscapes. Principle 3. Rewilding focuses on the recovery of ecological processes, interactions, and conditions based on reference ecosystems. Reference ecosystem should be self-sustaining and resilient. Contemporary near-natural reference areas with relatively complete biota. Where these still exist. Appropriate scientific or historical evidence. Supported by expert indigenous and local knowledge. Surrogate species can be used where key native species have gone extinct. Where legislation permits. Should be phylogenetically close to extinct species. Should have similar ecological and trophic functionality. Reintroductions and proxies. Locally extinct keystone species can be reintroduced from surviving populations elsewhere, e.g. beavers, wolves, bison. Globally extinct keystone species can be replaced by non-native or domesticated proxies that perform the same ecological function, e.g. Mauritian giant tortoises, replaced by Aldabra giant tortoises from Seychelles, Griffiths et al. 2010, e.g. European tarpans and aurochs, replaced by hardy breeds of domestic cattle and horses. Pleistocene rewilding. Baseline for habitat restoration. Usually taken as pre-industrial. May still represent severely degraded ecosystem. Megaherbivores, e.g. elephants, rhinos, disappeared from most ecosystems at the end of the Pleistocene. Coincident with spread of humans. Perform very important ecosystem functions. Long-distance seed dispersal. Long-distance nutrient transfer. Browsing woody vegetation. Creating savanna and steppe ecosystems. Could be replaced by introducing remaining megaherbivore species to new ecosystems, e.g. African forest elephants to Europe. Principle 4. Rewilding recognizes that ecosystems are dynamic and constantly changing. Rewilding should facilitate space and connectivity to allow natural processes to determine ecological trajectories. Succession, disturbance, biotic interactions should ensure that populations are able to respond to environmental change. Ecologically sustainable and genetically diverse. Where species habitats are globally rare. Traditional conservation methods may still be needed to prevent extinction. Principle 5. Rewilding should anticipate the effects of climate change and where possible act as a tool to mitigate impacts. Rewilding projects have medium to long-term time scales. Effects of climate change must be considered in project planning. Can provide nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Carbon capture. Flood prevention. Species range shifts. Principle 6. Rewilding requires local engagement and support. Rewilding projects should be inclusive of all stakeholders. Embrace participatory approaches. Include transparent local consultation. Encourage public understanding and appreciation of wild nature. Address concerns about coexisting with wildlife. About natural processes of disturbance. Principle 7. Rewilding is informed by science, traditional ecological knowledge, TEK, and other local knowledge. Holders of TEK and other local experts can provide detailed knowledge of sites, their histories, and processes. Can facilitate innovation and guide management. Requires knowledge exchange, transparency, mutual learning. Principle 8. Rewilding is adaptive and dependent on monitoring and feedback. Required to determine whether project is working as planned. Evidence of short and medium-term results. With long-term rewilding goals in mind. Used to identify problems and possible solutions. As part of an appropriate adaptive management framework. Need to be adequately resourced. So that further interventions can be implemented. Without loss to project budgets and resources. Principle 9. Rewilding recognizes the intrinsic value of all species and ecosystems. Primarily ecocentric. Rather than an anthropocentric. Management interventions. Should focus on removal of human control and restoring native species. With minimal intervention. Using non-lethal means wherever possible. Principle 10. Rewilding requires a paradigm shift in the coexistence of humans and nature. Should provide optimism, purpose, and motivation for engagement. Advocacy, activism, and political will for change. Should help shift ecological baselines toward fully functioning trophic ecosystems. Should help create new sustainable economic opportunities. Rewilding at different scales, John Lawton. Larger areas require less human intervention. Greater than 100,000 hectares, e.g. Yellowstone National Park, USA. Can support whole trophic range including large predators. No human intervention required. 10,000 to 100,000 hectares, e.g. Cairngorms Connect, Scotland. Can support wild large herbivore populations. Need to be regulated by humans. 1,000 to 10,000 hectares, e.g. Oostvaardersplassen, Netherlands. Can support semi-wild populations of large, domestic herbivores. 100 to 1,000 hectares, e.g. Benshore Moor, England. Can support managed herds of large, domestic herbivores year-round. 10 to 100 hectares. Can only support large domestic herbivores for part of the year. 1 to 10 hectares. Vegetation must be managed directly by humans. Workshops. Biodiversity in our lives. Shifting baseline syndrome. Biodiversity hotspots and cold spots. Role of museums in taxonomy and biodiversity science. Insectageddon. Biodiversity net gain. Benefit sharing agreement. Biodiversity action plan. Practice exam. Section A. 1. Using specific examples, discuss how countries can meet their obligations under the Convention for Biological Diversity with regard to benefit sharing and traditional ecological knowledge. 50%. 2. Which is most concerning, the extinction of rare species or the decline of formerly common ones. 50%. Section B. 3. Biodiversity is not distributed equally across the planet. Where do we find highly biodiverse areas and what are the drivers for the observed global biodiversity patterns? 50%. 4. We are in a global biodiversity crisis. What are the stumbling blocks faced in efforts to protect biodiversity? 50%. End of paper.